All right, let's now talk to Alistair Crooke, a former British intelligence officer who now studies Islamist militants. Thank you very much for coming on RT today. It's a pleasure to have you on. So, as we heard in the report, the UN says most of the Houla victims were shot at close range. Earlier reports also suggested many were stabbed. Who was behind the killings, do you think?
Well, I think what is quite important to say is, first of all, we don't know for sure yet. The investigation is going on. But one thing that stands out quite clearly, and which is very important, is that the methodology, this type of killing, of beheadings, of slitting of throats of children too, and of this mutilation of bodies, has been a characteristic not of Levantine Islam, not of Syria, not of Lebanon, but really of what happened in the Anbar province of Iraq. And so it seems to point very much in the direction of groups that have been associated with the war in Iraq against the United States, who perhaps returned to Syria, or perhaps Iraqis who've come up from Anbar to take part of it. I do say we don't know at this stage, but this whole process of mutilation is so very much against the tradition of the Levantine Islam that I think it's very hard to see this will have come either from soldiers or even from others who might have been bent on revenge. I think quite clearly we've got a lot of people there. That means there are 108 people who were killed either directly and by direct fire, or had their throats cut, or who were beheaded. I don't think this speaks of soldiers going on the rampage. We've seen that in Vietnam, we've seen that in Iraq, and indeed in Afghanistan. And usually soldiers don't swap their weapons. They don't move over and turn to using shotguns. They use their own weapons. And these were said directly by the UN. Many of them were to have been killed by shotguns.
But if I may, I'm very sorry to interrupt you. But I'm sorry to interrupt you. But if I may, for a moment, we understand there are certain fractured groups when it comes to the opposition, those against the Assad regime. Is it possible that a fraction group, and we know at least one of them has been calling for UN intervention, could they be behind such a thing? Because such a caliber or level of this atrocity would perhaps get the attention of the UN Security Council and further them to get involved.
I think this is certainly very much a possibility, that what we're looking at here is a deliberate and cold-blooded, as I say, rather than a revenge attack, a cold-blooded attempt to cast Syria into civil war, to inaugurate civil war, to bring Western intervention if possible, but simply, again, to bring down the regime. And it is clearly, I think, perpetrated in the interests of those external parties and the groups at the end of the spectrum of the opposition, which are jihadi groups who want no part of a peace process, but to want to bring down the system and for Syria to turn into civil war. And it's from that I think we are seeing what's happening in these events.
But when you talk about jihadi groups getting involved and wanting a civil war and wanting the end of the Assad regime, are we talking Al-Qaeda?
Well, actually, I think it's more close to Musab Zarqawi than Al-Qaeda as we know it, in the sense that Zarqawi in Iraq gave birth to this idea of a very strong, bigoted, anti-Shia, anti-Iranian rhetoric. And much of that came back into Syria when some of those fighters from Anbar returned to their homes around Homs and Hama. So, yes, we're talking about Al-Qaeda-like groups that have got at the very end of the spectrum of the opposition. They may be a minority in terms of the numbers of the overall opposition, but they are now defining the war. The car bombs in Damascus and Aleppo, the outrages that took place in Houla and also in other areas, the direct assassination of people.
But Mr. Crooke, what about external support to this conflict? Because we understand that quite a fair amount of weapons are coming in to support the rebels from Lebanon. How crucial is that support, do you think?
Well, I think it is crucial. If you recall, the passageway is coming through Tripoli, which has a historic link with Homs. which is a seat of a radical Salafist group that was also involved in the war in Iraq. And we saw just the other week when a large shipment of very sophisticated weapons, by some estimates $40 million worth of armaments, were being shipped into Tripoli for the Syrian opposition. And they included weapons which are not really defensive. It was very carefully put together cargo which suggested a long-term military offensive against the government rather than anything that was of a short-term nature. Something very serious, very sophisticated, sometimes very latest equipment in terms of communications were included in that cargo.
Alistair Crooke, a former British intelligence officer, wishing we had more time for this conversation. We don't, but thank you for coming on RT today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.